Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the IPS Nathan Lecture Series by Professor Lily Kong, our 15th SR Nathan Fellow for the Study of Singapore. Today, Professor Kong will be delivering her third and final lecture titled Beyond the Ivory Tower, Research and Dilemmas of Quality and Relevance. Following her lecture, Professor Kong will take questions from the audience in a Q&A session. The Q&A session will be chaired by Professor Chan Heng Chi, SUTD Honorary Professor, Lee Kuan Yew Center for Innovative Cities, and IPS's 7th SR Nathan Fellow. Before we begin, please allow me to go over some housekeeping rules for the event. Thank you for joining us at the auditorium today. Please be reminded to switch your mobile phones to silent mode. The lecture is being streamed live on Facebook. It will also be recorded and uploaded onto our IPS website and YouTube channel later. Please submit your comments and questions at any time during the lecture through the Facebook comments. For our audience members here at the auditorium today, please step up to the mic during the Q&A session to ask your questions. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, I would like to invite Professor Lily Kong to begin her third lecture titled Beyond the Ivory Tower, Research and the Dilemmas of Quality and Relevance. Professor Kong, please.
Thank you. A very good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for coming on a wet Wednesday afternoon. For those of you who have stayed the course with me through my last two lectures and are here again today, thank you. As much a reprise for you as a capsule summary for those who are attending for the first time, let me take just 2 minutes to recall the substance of the last two lectures. In my first lecture, I invited you on a journey through the looking glass, where I examined the historical evolution of universities, beginning with their origins in classical antiquity and tracing their transformations through post-industrial society. This lens revealed that the role of the university has never been static. It has continually adapted to shifting societal, political, and economic forces. Each epoch reframed the university's purpose, whether as a bastion of knowledge, a vehicle for social mobility, or a site of economic innovation. Building on these historical insights, my second lecture focused on how we should rethink key dimensions of university education. First, I challenged the traditional emphasis on cognitive development, arguing for a more holistic approach that nurtures the individual in mind, character, and spirit. Next, as we enter an era defined by big data and artificial intelligence, I posed the question, how can universities cultivate human qualities such as empathy, ethical judgment, and creativity that will be essential in the future? Third, I examined the constraints of rigid disciplinary boundaries, proposing that universities must champion interdisciplinary learning to address complex global challenges effectively. Finally, I broadened the concept of learning itself, highlighting that education transcends academic walls and spans the social, professional, and personal spheres encountered throughout life. I concluded with an imperative. Universities must undertake bold, transformative steps to stay relevant and impactful in the coming century. This imperative is underlined by the likelihood of increased lifespans, with a 100-year life potentially within reach for many, reshaping both individual and institutional aspirations. Today, I turn from education to the research mission of universities, continuing where I left off in my first lecture. Then, I had introduced two discontents with contemporary universities relating to research: the balance between research and teaching, and the balance between research as intellectual exercise and research to solve societal challenges. I introduced the historical development of the research university to illustrate how these tensions have been played out over the decades. I also asked questions about whether the realities of global rankings have caused universities to become absorbed by the chase for research metrics at the expense of research that makes societal impact and to the detriment of high-quality educational experiences. Universities hold a unique and privileged position as the brain trusts of society, serving as key hubs for the knowledge creation and innovation that drive the betterment of society. Some of the most groundbreaking research that has reshaped human history and redefined what is possible for our collective future has emanated from universities, from the discovery of insulin at the University of Toronto in 1921, to the invention of the seat belt at the University of Minnesota in the 1950s, to the development of the AstraZeneca COVID vaccine at Oxford in 2020. While these have fundamentally changed lives, not everyone agrees that universities should be seized by research for pragmatic applied ends, what has been termed primitive utilitarianism, even anti-intellectual, by the likes of Robert Maynard Hutchins, the University of Chicago president from 1927 to 1951, whom I'd introduced in my first lecture. Others like him, including Wilhelm von Humboldt, whom I also introduced in my first lecture, have argued that research should be, I quote, unfettered by utilitarian considerations, and universities should be sites of intellectual freedom and high-minded cultivation. As with so many things, binaries are unhelpful. Universities should afford freedom of research, including fundamental and curiosity-driven research, but as society's brain trusts, universities must also bear the responsibility of going beyond the production of knowledge for its own sake to serve the public good. They must maintain the freedom and autonomy necessary for groundbreaking inquiry, but also respond to the needs and expectations of the public they serve as a form of public accountability. Derek Bock, former president of Harvard University, highlights the responsibility of universities, describing them as, I quote, the primary source of expertise for addressing our most urgent global challenges, from climate change to public health, to economic inequality and technological disruption. There are at least 3 ways in which university research serves the public good. First, knowledge experts at universities have the ability to inform policy and reshape practice beyond their institutions by providing the evidence base for decision-making and strategic thinking in governments, corporations, and nonprofits, enabling shifts in policy and behavior, contributing to public debate and public benefit, and shaping shared understanding and beliefs. Second, research catalyzes innovation and enterprise. Research in universities drives the development of new technologies, industries, and solutions to some of the world's most complex problems. Breakthroughs in clean energy, artificial intelligence, and healthcare, for example, are reshaping economies and improving lives. Research in universities alone, however, is insufficient. In many countries, research in the public and private sectors plays a significant role too. Research alone is also insufficient if not coupled with business innovation and the capability to commercialize research. Knowledge transfer, product development, spin-off companies, evidence-based market behavior analysis, and other dimensions in a holistic innovation and entrepreneurship ecosystem approach are essential. But university research is foundational to these endeavors. Third, university-led research can also serve the public good by countering misinformation and pseudoscience. The World Health Organization has described this era as one of infodemics, where false information spreads faster than factual content, with far-reaching and sometimes devastating effects. In such a context, universities must provide evidence-based insights that inform public understanding and support more informed decision-making. As custodians of rigorous, evidence-based knowledge, they are the bulwark against the proliferation of unverified and harmful information. So how are universities responding to these opportunities and responsibilities? Clearly, with some of the examples I have cited, there is outstanding evidence of how universities have impacted myriad aspects of human life. Yet, the potential is far from fulfilled. In fact, in the spirit of provocation, one might ask if there is a crisis of direction. Continuing my reference to Alice in Wonderland, I found a conversation between Alice and the Cheshire Cat uncannily accurate. Reflect on the conversation as if Alice were referring to research directions. Let's see. Alice says, "Would you tell me please which way I ought to go from here?" And the Cheshire Cat responds, "That depends on a good deal on where you want to get to." And she says, "I don't much care where." And Cat replies, "Then it doesn't matter which way you go, so long as I get somewhere," she says. "Oh, you're sure to do so, or you're sure to do that, if only you walk long enough." The conversation may be framed as a question to universities and researchers about where they wish to go with their research. In the absence of purpose-driven thinking about what research is for, it is easy to chase misplaced goals. At the heart of the problem are two phenomena in academia that have emerged over the latter half of the 20th century. The first is the publish or perish culture, a concept that is attributed to Logan Wilson in his 1942 book that analyzes the sociology of the academic profession. It refers to the pressure to publish in order to progress in academic careers, failing which one has no choice but to leave the profession when the tenure clock is up. Publications in top-tier journals, defined as high-impact factor journals, with university presses garnering high citations, better if they are home-run publications, that is, publications with outsized citations, fine-tuned in analysis to H indices and field-weighted citation indices and more. This is the dominant language of evaluation. To the lay person, trying to comprehend all of this is like Alice trying to figure out what the characters in Wonderland are saying, where statements make no sense and she is unable to engage. The reality for academics is that individual career progression is heavily influenced by these metrics, impacting tenure decisions, promotions, and funding opportunities. In a recent study surveying over 30,000 faculty members from 10 top universities around the world, most respondents admitted to using citation counts as a primary criterion for evaluating research candidates. This is used as a proxy for academic quality and impact. Journal impact factors, which measure the importance of a journal by calculating the number of times articles published therein are cited, are used as proxies for how good or how important an article is. A paper published in a high impact factor journal is assumed to be better than an article published in a lower impact factor journal. And yet, this logic is clearly flawed. At its most meaningful, academic impact comes when research shifts understanding by advancing theory and method, or when it changes received wisdom about something. Where we publish and how many cite us are imperfect proxy indicators. Helpful but imperfect. The second phenomenon is the rise of university rankings, with arguably the most widely cited ones in our part of the world at least being the Times Higher Education and QS rankings. They privilege research, and particularly standardized metrics of research such as citations. THE, Times Higher Ed, allocates more than 60% of its score to research, including research reputation, where publications and citations play a crucial role. QS allocates 55% to research and reputation. So in the race for rankings, institutions have been willing to justify, preposterously in my view, the imbalance in attention to teaching and research in the following manner. I quote, "For students, the value of their credential, their degree, is in large part a function of the prestige of the institution, which is driven by research as reflected in rankings and prizes. Every marginal bit of effort the university puts into research may be at the expense of students' education, but ultimately benefits them in the long run, according to this logic. I hope you will join me in feeling indignant about such logic." I hope you got that. I hope you're feeling indignant, because I am. The cultures of publish or perish and the fixation with rankings have led to a range of malpractices and misdirections, to varying degrees of severity. I will elaborate on 5. Misconduct, manipulation, magniloquence, mistreatment, and misalignment. First, misconduct. As universities are increasingly drawn into quantitative standards of success with metrics-driven incentives in competitive environments, ethical compromises have alas emerged. Breach of academic integrity takes various forms, from questionable practices at the margins to full-scale misconduct. In the race to publish, researchers may use questionable research practices to yield publishable outcomes, which undermine the credibility of results. One prominent tactic is known as p-hacking, also referred to as data snooping or data dredging. Researchers perform many statistical tests on data, the same set of data, but only report those that are statistically significant. And this results in an increased likelihood of false positives. P-hacking is generally viewed as a process whereby researchers pursue publishable results through trial and error, often neglecting the theoretical foundations of their work. More troubling than p-hacking is outright data fabrication, which can derail entire fields of study. A high-profile case in Alzheimer's research, where falsified data was used, led to wasted years of effort and substantial financial losses, setting back critical medical advances. A neuroscientist, and I won't name the institution, came under scrutiny for allegedly tampering with data with hundreds of images of the brain showing unwarranted interference. Some of these interferences were described as shockingly blatant, combining images from different experiments, potentially altering results to better fit the hypothesis. The tragedy is that this is not an isolated incident. In 2023 alone, more than 10,000 research papers were retracted globally. This marked a new record. The huge numbers of retractions indicates a lot of research funding is being wasted. and more importantly, the publication of so much flawed data or flawed research also misleads other researchers who build their work on what they see and undermines scientific integrity, leading to mistrust in science. As we move further into the age of generative AI, the issues will only exacerbate. Already, AI tools are capable of generating seemingly credible abstracts that can fool even experienced scientists. Using this technology, a scientist can easily generate a scientific paper and plant citations as they see fit in the bibliography. For example, to themselves to boost their own reputations, or to another scientist in return for a fee. In fact, experiments have shown that AI-generated papers, while lacking genuine scientific contributions, have been uploaded to major preprint servers with minimal pushback. Those who intend to game the system can also use AI to paraphrase existing papers, relying on their structure and contributions to produce a convincing manuscript. The consequences of such breaches reach far beyond academic reputations. They can result in misguided policies and actions, for example, flawed public health policies, ineffective treatments, if hopefully not harmful, and even life-threatening outcomes. Of course, distortions of research reports are not always due to researcher misconduct. Research, particularly complex findings, is often simplified into misleading headlines or misinterpreted in public discourse. Climate change research is a stark example. Despite overwhelming scientific consensus on the reality of human-driven climate change, media outlets at times amplify fringe voices or cherry-pick data to perpetuate public skepticism about human-driven climate change. Such misrepresentation distorts public understanding and erodes trust in science. Building public trust also requires greater transparency in the research process. Initiatives like the Open Science Framework advocate for openly sharing data, methodologies, and protocols, making research more accessible and verifiable. This commitment to openness allows scrutiny, ensures greater public accountability, and thus strengthens research integrity. A second area of concern is citation manipulation. While not amounting to data or textual fabrication, this is a troubling form of academic dishonesty that borders on fabrication. It is the practice of dishonestly citing sources to boost a paper's or a journal's citation count. This often occurs when researchers or journals artificially inflate their citation metrics in a bid to improve their standing within the academic community. Citation manipulation may be done via coercive citation, that is, when editors pressure authors to add citations from the editor's journal on very thin academic grounds. In one study, 20% of respondents reported experiencing coercive citation, while over 50%, 50, admitted they would add unnecessary citations to improve their chances of publication. How does that work? Let me just elaborate in a moment, right? So if you cite someone who is likely to be the reviewer of your paper, the person is more likely to say, yeah, this is a good paper. Okay? Now, in extreme cases, entire journals have been discovered to engage in what is called citation cartels. You thought there were only oil cartels. But there's such a thing as citation cartels where authors and editors collude to disproportionately cite each other's work to inflate their citation counts and impact factors. This exploitation of the citation system not only undermines the credibility of the journal, but also warps the academic ecosystem by privileging researchers who play the metrics game, often at the expense of real innovation. The growing reliance on platforms like Google Scholar introduces another set of challenges. While widely used to track citations and academic impact, Google Scholar indiscriminately indexes documents, allowing low-quality or even fraudulent papers to appear alongside rigorously peer-reviewed work. Studies show that more than 60% of users retrieve citation data from Google Scholar, including my own university. And the platform is used more frequently than all other sources combined when evaluating candidates for academic hiring and promotion. However, its lack of moderation raises concerns about academic integrity. This creates opportunities for citation manipulation to go unnoticed, further eroding the credibility of research evaluation. A third area of concern is the tendency towards magniloquence. This is the habit of using flowery, ornate language, jargon, and complicated sentence structures in publications to say the simplest things. I have illustrated this myself in using the word magniloquence, just to make the point. This is not a new phenomenon, but exacerbated perhaps by the pressures to publish and an illusion that the more profound a paper sounds, the greater the chances of publication. As renowned sociologist, the late Charles Wright Mills wrote in relation to intellectual craftsmanship, I quote, "The lack of ready intelligibility usually has little or nothing to do with the complexity of subject matter and nothing at all with profundity of thought. It has to do almost entirely with certain confusions of the academic writer about his or her own status." He called it, I quote, "a serious crisis in literacy, that peculiar language," his words, "is in use even when it is unnecessary and not at all due to any profound and subtle issues, concepts, methods." He goes on to describe such writing as Byzantine and verbiage. In his view, I quote, "To overcome the academic prose, you have to first overcome the academic pose." He thus exhorts scholars to, and I quote again, "assume that an audience is before you and that they have a right to know. Assume that you want to let them know. Now write." A most egregious example of unintelligibility taken to an extreme was the scholarly hoax undertaken by physics professor Alan Sokal in 1996. His article, Transgressing the Boundaries Towards a Transformative Hermeneutics of Quantum Gravity, was published in the journal Social Text and proposed that quantum gravity is a social and linguistic construct. Sokal subsequently revealed that it was a hoax. He had read claims that some journals would publish, humanities journals, would publish anything so long as it contained the proper leftist thought and quoted or was written by well-known leftist thinkers. He thus wrote rubbish using such language, and he was published. His calling out the troubles with academic writing has, alas, not reversed the troubling practices. Magniloquence, I use the word because I wanted an M, you notice. Magniloquence, but I also wanted to make the point about, ornate language. Magniloquence, verbiage, and lost intelligibility may not pose threats at the same level as misconduct and manipulation, but they are a terrible waste of intellectual resources that could have been put to better use. It is a sad comment about researchers who engage in such practice that, like Alice, They don't much care where they go, so long as they get somewhere, meaning they get published. Fourth, mistreatment. The Stanford University Postdoctoral Association, in commenting on the conditions that confront graduate students and postdoctoral researchers, used the phrase, "Prestige does not prevent poverty." The reference was to the long reliance in American academia on the cheap, skilled labor of graduate students and postdoctoral researchers who struggle to make ends meet, even those in the elite institutions, working long hours in the pressured atmosphere of competitive research. To make academic science a good career again, it is said that research needs a radical restructuring. Setting aside the assumption that academic positions confer prestige, I'm not sure about that, but let's just set that aside for a moment. The discussion about poor work conditions and unhealthy research environments in the American context has been amplified in the UK in recent years, with attention focused on what is called research culture. Numerous studies have been undertaken to understand the nature of this culture. Research from the University of Bristol has found researchers demoralized by a culture that disincentivizes sharing and collaboration, that encourages questionable research practices such as data manipulation, and increases the risk of bias. Researchers worried about their ideas being scooped, younger or less experienced researchers not receiving proportional credit for their work, and fear discrimination in research assessment based on personal characteristics of the researcher, such as gender. The focus on traditional peer-reviewed papers is thought to be a major contributory factor to this malaise. A report commissioned by the Wellcome Trust in 2020 further highlighted that the focus on the quantity of outputs and narrow concepts of impact rather than real quality were causing intense pressures to publish with too little value placed on how results are achieved and the human costs. Their study, based on literature reviews, qualitative interviews, workshops, and a survey of over 4,000 researchers, showed that competition was accepted to be a part of working in research, no doubt about that, but that such competition had become aggressive and harmful. The report reinforced the Bristol study regarding discrimination and went further to highlight exploitation, harassment, and bullying. These have dire consequences. For researchers, poor research culture is leading to stress, anxiety, mental health problems, strain on personal relationships, and a sense of isolation and loneliness at work. For research, the perceived impacts include a loss of quality, with corners being cut and outputs becoming increasingly superficial, problems with reproducibility, and the cherry-picking of results and data massaging. And for society, the dangers are seen as loss of talent from the sector, and people are just so frustrated they don't even want to join the research sector, and a reduction of real innovation and impact resulting from a narrow set of priorities, as well as a loss of trust from the public. These are the sorts of challenges that come with those narrow metrics of how many have you published, where have you published, and what are your citation counts, and which are used in global rankings. Finally, I would like to focus on misalignment, the misalignment between what has come to be valued by the academic community, and I generalize there, and what society needs, and between disciplinarity and interdisciplinarity. In those areas of research that interface with policy, critique is often what drives research. Critique can certainly provide useful perspectives, but scholars do not always see themselves as having any responsibility to propose alternatives, and there's there's a certain measure of validity there. But let us ask ourselves for the variety of reasons that may be posited for the limited impact of scholarly work on public or corporate policy or on behavioral change in society. The first is that many view such research as driven by the political and other dictates of government, of research funding bodies, and corporations. It is thus viewed as likely to be compromised in scope and orientation from the very start. In other words, policy studies for many threaten the very independence of interest, thought, and method that is thought to be the hallmark of academia. Further, policy research is deemed as typically making little contribution to the underlying theoretical development of disciplines. Indeed, those who market themselves to capital or to the state to facilitate capital-state interventions are sometimes looked upon with disdain, thus leading inexorably to a position of principled non-participation. Instead, there are those who prioritize the task of research to be first about understanding how the world is changing and then transmitting that understanding widely. They view research that engages with state and capital as, I quote, dining with the devil. A second reason for the misalignment between what researchers seek to do, or some researchers seek to do, and what society needs of them in contributing to more applied work, particularly in policy, is the conception of policy study as somehow intellectually inferior to the higher pursuit of theorizing. Policy study is seen as simply applied, often atheoretical and merely descriptive. More often than not, policy work is seen as bad science or second-rate science, second-rate research, regarded as narrow technical concerns to be tackled within the confines of state and stated aims and objectives. Such practical knowledge is viewed as incompatible with abstract and scientific knowledge. Producing abstract scientific knowledge is deemed respectable mental labor, while policy research is considered manual labor. This parallels the intellectual and class snobbery that John Dewey had pointed to as an explanation for the unwillingness among scholars to undertake applied work. As shared in my first lecture, Dewey explained the privileging of theoretical work thus, I quote, "The notion that applied knowledge is somehow less worthy than pure knowledge was natural to a society in which all useful work was performed by slaves and serfs, and where science, or the highest knowing, was identified with pure theorizing apart from all application in the uses of life." He argued that the distinction between pure and applied science was an artificial one, and brings with it an unhealthy honor of what is pure and contempt for what is applied. This then leads to a science which is remote and technical, communicable only to specialists, while simultaneously it leads to a conduct of human affairs which is haphazard, biased, not evidence-based, uninformed. Yet, serious policy study is extremely demanding intellectually. It requires not only a deep theoretical, empirical understanding of the problems, which are the focus of policies being investigated, but also the development of appropriate methods and procedures for assessing these policies. Thus, the relationship between theory and policy should be an interactive and recursive one, and fully worthy of research attention. If the first misalignment is between critique and contribution, the second misalignment is between disciplinarity and interdisciplinarity. There is little doubt that solutions to the world's many challenges require expertise from different disciplines. Yet, as I shared in my second lecture, universities are organized along disciplinary lines. Interdisciplines are thought to be broad but lacking in depth. And interdisciplinary programs are the most likely first candidates for sacrifice when a financial crunch hits. Those who publish in interdisciplinary ways find themselves falling between two or more stools, as promotion and tenure are organized along disciplinary departmental lines. Bob Brown, the former president of Boston University and up till recently the chair of the Academic Research Council that advises Singapore's Ministry of Education, wrote compellingly about this issue recently. He observed that even the common remedy of creating space for interdisciplinarity through research institutes and centers does not work because departments are where faculty are hired, where they reside, and where they're promoted, and they will respond to those imperatives. Thus, fostering converging research remains an afterthought, and efforts to measure success do no better than count co-authored papers and the square footage of shared laboratory space. He calls for making academic boundaries that are closely guarded by departments more porous, so that faculty may have more flexibility in their academic appointments with their feet in several disciplines. He argues that this cannot be left to informal or ad hoc agreements between departments. It requires strong academic leadership from the center. I'm looking at my leaders. He acknowledges that faculty will bristle, his words, bristle at the recommendation of a more intentional research strategy. For the doctrine in the last century has been to let 1,000 flowers bloom in the academic garden. Yet, while this narrative keeps the peace with faculty, Brown argues that it is impractical for universities that truly want to make a difference with their research to continue in this manner. He urges that universities press on with developing more intentional research strategies, and to enable that, university hiring should be centrally organized around interdisciplinarity. I think some deans are going to come and see me after this. To address the challenges posed by misinformation, misconduct, manipulation, magniloquence, mistreatment, and misalignment, universities urgently need to reflect and act. Minimally, universities need to ensure that there are robust oversight mechanisms to ensure rigorous review and evaluation. Careful scrutiny, especially at critical junctures of gatekeeping, hiring, promotion, tenure, will send the signal that research integrity is taken seriously. Universities need to cultivate environments that reward ethical practices, or at least not to reward unethical practices inadvertently. Pairing that with open science practices will help. But more fundamentally, addressing work culture and disincentivizing malpractices require that we think differently about what research is for and how we evaluate it. A more holistic approach to research evaluation could offer a path forward. Were we to think of research impact not only in academic terms, but also in societal terms, then the outputs, outcomes, and impact measures broaden. If citations and their associated metrics such as journal impact factors mattered only at most as much as the qualitative impact of scholarship, such as improvement in the lives of those living with Alzheimer's or the assurance of retirement adequacy for seniors, then citation fraud, first of all, then citations become less important and citation fraud becomes disincentivized. Various efforts around the world have sought to take a position to counter what I call the metricization of research performance. I cite 4 examples. First, the San Francisco Declaration on Research Assessment, or DORA, 2013, is a statement that denounces, I quote, denounces the practice of correlating the journal impact factor to the merits of specific scientists of a specific scientist's contributions, given how it creates biases and inaccuracies when appraising scientific research. It decries the use of the impact factor as a substitute for measuring the quality of individual research articles or in hiring, promotion, or funding decisions. The declaration seeks to raise awareness of the responsible use of metrics. They're not saying don't use any metrics, but use it responsibly to facilitate, and they also aim to facilitate the development of new policies and practices for hiring, promotion, and funding decisions. They seek to catalyze research assessment reform and to improve equity in research assessment. That's the first, DORA. The second is the Leiden Manifesto for Research Metrics, 2015. That similarly arose from a worry about impact factor obsession and advocates that research be evaluated based on broader contributions. This shift would allow institutions to emphasize the real-world implications of their work, aligning academic priorities with societal needs and mitigating incentives for unethical practices. The 10 principles of the Leiden Manifesto focus on maybe 3 key dimensions. First, several principles of the manifesto relate to the assessment of research. A case is made for qualitative assessment to judge research portfolios, and any quantitative evaluation supports that, doesn't overshadow that, doesn't become the only measure, as is sometimes the case, often the case. When quantitative assessment is used, such as publications and citations, differences across disciplines should be accounted for. There should not be a misplaced concreteness and false precision in quantitative measures, such as when journal impact factors go into 3 decimal points. So a journal with 1.234 is better than a journal with 1.233. Really? It is also important to recognize that there are systemic effects of assessment and indicators. Right? So one set of principles is around the quantitative metrics and the challenges around that. Second, it is critical to recognize different missions and assess them differently. Individual researchers, research groups, and institutions should be assessed against their mission. Once you agree on the mission, they should be assessed against the mission and not against some universal standard, such as in the rankings. This recognizes that some may be much more driven by blue sky fundamental research, while others are much more focused on downstream applied work, and they should be evaluated accordingly. Relatedly, some institutions are driven by a mission to impact their local intellectual and policy communities. Writing in vernacular languages and publishing in local journals achieves this better rather than insisting on English language high impact factor journals gate-kept and published in vastly different environments and contexts. The manifesto thus calls for the protection of excellence in locally relevant research. A third set of principles that underpin the manifesto revolve around open, transparent, and simple processes of evaluation and ensuring that those who are evaluated can verify the data and the analysis. This builds trust in the system. Now, besides DORA and the Leiden Manifesto, a third effort to counter the metricization of research performance is evidenced in the European Science Foundation's conceptual framing of research impact. It recognizes academic impact, that box in blue, in terms of contribution to advances in understanding, method, theory, and application. But beyond academic impact, the framework is actually dominated by everything else, as you can see. It recognizes cultural, economic, educational, environmental, health, political, social, and technological impacts. And if you are able to read the small print, it elaborates on what all this means. But it is intuitive, right? This explicit acknowledgement and conceptualization of different types of impact beyond the academic offers a useful device for researchers and institutions to frame their contributions. Fourth, I cite the parallel example of the UK Economic and Social Research Council, or ESRC's, effort to redefine research impact, referring to the demonstrable contribution that excellent research makes to society and the economy, benefiting individuals, organizations, regions, or nations. The ESRC further categorizes impact into three key areas. Instrumental impact, referring to the influence on policy, legislation, or behaviors. Second, conceptual impact, referring to the reframing of debates or contributing to understanding complex issues. One might say that's quite aligned with academic impact. And then there's a third area of impact, which is capacity building, which we typically don't think about that much, referring to improving technical and personal skills through research applications. So all the research that we do, how does that contribute to actually the reskilling and upskilling of society? These categories highlight that impactful research is not confined only to academic publications, but extends to real-world outcomes. As calls grow louder for universities to demonstrate clear societal benefits, a 2023 survey conducted by Elsevier highlighted a critical concern. While 68% of academic leaders, researchers, and funders anticipate an increasing public demand for government-funded research to yield tangible societal benefits, 68%, only half believe that existing evaluation systems actually take that on board. Elsevier's chief academic officer has underscored the urgency of this shift. He warned that if universities are not seen to be delivering benefits for society, their funding will be at risk, capturing the growing skepticism among the public and policymakers who question the value of research that appears detached from societal needs. At the same time, 72% of funders are advocating for a broader, holistic evaluation approach. But despite these calls for change, several obstacles remain, including a lack of standardized frameworks to think about impact, institutional inertia, and that's very often because the people who are already successful have come through a system with metrics that they're used to. And of course, all institutions face limited resources to go and take on another piece of work. Declarations, manifestos, frameworks, and definitions are well and good. But what systemic effects do they have on reshaping the motivations and behaviors of researchers and universities? How exactly do they translate into different everyday practices of research assessment and evaluation that pervade universities and funding agencies? And how do researchers themselves adopt markers of excellence and impact? Ideally, they should stimulate a fundamental reflection among researchers on why research is undertaken. As I often ask or encourage my students, they should undertake research because they see a societal challenge to address or have a desire to explain something to a community that has remained misunderstood or unexplained, whether it is an academic community, a policy community, a business community, or a local community. The desired impact of their work is to contribute to a different perspective or be part of a solution. This is in contrast to starting a research project because there is a gap in the literature and hence a publication opportunity. This gives our work greater purpose. It entails identifying key stakeholders, understanding their needs, and working with them to frame the research from the start. Where relevant, it extends to engaging stakeholders in translating research findings into actionable outcomes. Likewise, we need to reconsider who we want our research to speak to. Far too often, academics focus solely on communicating their research with their peers, other academics, particularly those in the global north, through journals and conferences that are gate-kept there. However, impactful research will also need to engage our own communities, the people we study, policymakers, business leaders, civic and volunteer organizations, and even the broader public. Research dissemination then needs to extend beyond traditional academic formats in order to reach those different audiences, such as through podcasts, videos, exhibitions, films, popular books, publications targeted at professional bodies, trade associations, communities of practice, perhaps even making their way into policy papers, consultancy reports, and pedagogical guides and toolkits. These become additional channels that make research more accessible and actionable. How do we account for such diverse forms of research communication within standard research evaluation systems? In May 2023, during his presidential address titled Consequential Research in Education, American Educational Research Association President Rich Milner emphasized the importance of consequentialism in research. Milner urged researchers to constantly reflect on questions such as, who am I as a researcher? How do I engage with the world? With whom? On whose behalf and why? Milner stressed the need for an epistemic reinvestment in consequential research. I apologize for the jargon. To do so, we must leave our offices and labs and engage directly with people. According to Milner, impactful work happens not behind a computer screen, within academic confines, but out in the community with those who are suffering the most. Not everyone will agree with this, and with reason. Theoretical mathematics, in large part inspired by intellectual curiosity, may provide the tools for scientific discoveries far into the future, in ways not always anticipated. Number theory was developed without cryptography in mind, but later became useful there. So we must keep the space for fundamental theoretical research that does not have immediate applicability and is indeed taking place behind the computer screen. The issue of consequentialism is not an either-or in terms of theoretical or applied work, but both and. This is perhaps apparent in a call by David Deming, who's a Harvard Kennedy School professor of economics, and he made a case for some space in his profession to recognize what he calls more useful research, but without suggesting that academic research must be diminished. First, he advocates that departments should reward research with practical value when hiring and promoting faculty. Second, he calls for the creation of more prizes for public impact, citing how the American Economic Association gives out more than a dozen awards each year, with none directly rewarding economics for contributing to society at large. He advocates new awards to balance the slate. Third, Deming calls for increased government funding for economics research with a dedicated stream to support work which demonstrates real-world consequences. In Deming's call, we begin to see some concrete ideas about what changes might potentially help shift the needle. Another effort has emerged since 2011 in the form of altmetrics, which attempts to offer a different metric to the traditional bibliometrics. It tracks published research in social media, news outlets, policy papers, and other appearances. It recognizes that research is picked up in different discussions and fora and influences policy and public opinion and industry. It therefore offers a lens into measuring how academic work reaches non-academic audience, providing insights into the societal reach of research by measuring dissemination to diverse audiences, essentially moving research from scholars to society. However, altmetric data has its own challenges and need to be interpreted with caution, given that they are drawn from a large number of sources with inconsistencies in the quality. It is also unclear how they are calculated and are susceptible to manipulation, just as traditional bibliometrics are. Other data may well become more useful over time to diversify the focus on citation counts in academic publications, though no doubt each will have its own need for cautious interpretation. Overton, for example, claims to be the world's largest searchable index of policy documents, guidelines, think tank publications, and working papers, collecting data from 188 countries. It tracks academic papers that are cited in such government consultation documents and reports so that researchers can see where their ideas and publications are cited and how used, thus discovering how one's work may be influencing or changing practice in the real world. Other databases like lens.org track citations of academic works in patents, which shows how research enables problem solving. Even with these different approaches, challenges remain in accurately capturing societal impact. Determining causality and identifying a specific research output's contribution is challenging. A key distinction in evaluating impact lies between attribution and contribution. Whereas attribution seeks a causal link between specific research outputs and societal outcomes. You can attribute this outcome to this research. Contribution considers how research practices support broader societal goals. This perspective is particularly important given the complex and often indirect pathways through which research influences change and the different time spans between research and impact. So, for those of us who are in the business of evaluating research, I think it's important for us to try and tell apart attribution and contribution and to recognize contribution, not just attribution. Difficult task. The difficulty of determining causality is further complicated by factors such as the international nature of research and the extended timelines required to observe societal shifts. Indeed, multi-actor interdisciplinary research holds promise for impactful outcomes, yet the complexity of such projects complicates direct attribution to university research alone. Therefore, policymakers are encouraged to prioritize incentives for universities to tackle societal issues rather than narrowly focusing on tracing precise impact origins. And universities must stand ready to valorize contribution even if direct attribution cannot be claimed. In the UK, to reduce the effects of metricization and incentivize research with societal value and impact, its research assessment exercise RAE was transformed into the Research Excellence Framework REF, starting 2014. The REF assessment focuses on research outputs, but also on research impact and research environment. Outputs are well understood, especially in terms of publications. Impact is defined as an effect on, change, or benefit to the economy, society, culture, public policy, or services, health, the environment, quality of life, beyond academia. This is to be captured via impact case studies with corroborating evidence. Environment, the third component, refers to some of those areas of research culture that I had discussed earlier. While it seems a step in the right direction, REF has actually been criticized for too much emphasis on research impact outside the university system, for encouraging mediocrity in published research because it shifts attention away from just the publications, and for discouraging research with long-term value. How much of this pushback is conservatism and a preference for traditional academic practices, and how much of it is a reasonable, conceptual approach that has become overly skewed in practice and therefore not optimally executed, is open to interpretation. The truth is likely somewhere in between. Criticisms of REF notwithstanding, a similar approach has been adopted in Hong Kong in its research assessment exercise, as well as in Australia's engagement and impact assessment. A most recent effort reported earlier this month, similarly attempts to assess and measure research performance, taking into account both academic and societal impact. Undertaken by the Financial Times to assess business schools for their rigor, resonance, and relevance of their research, the rankings attempt to systematically measure each of these dimensions. First, it seeks to acknowledge the importance of rigorous, high-quality research, and it uses the established metrics of field-weighted citation indices and publications in journals and so forth. But it goes beyond just that. Second, it seeks to take into account what they call resonance, which is defined as the way in which research engages with practice, where scholars' works are disseminated to policymakers and decision-makers in the public, private, and non-profit sectors, and is read and acted upon by those beyond universities. And it does so by monitoring downloads by users identified as working in government or companies, tracking citations of academic work in patents, in government consultation documents, in think tank reports, tracking utilization of textbooks and journal articles that are assigned by professors in other institutions, and tracking the most popular teaching case studies. Resonance. Third, it also seeks to measure relevance, and it does so by looking at how far the content of publications align with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. The architects of this new ranking recognize that not everyone will agree with the metrics and the weightage assigned to different measures, but offer them as, I quote, a starting point for a wider debate. They publish rankings using an aggregated measure, but also by each different criteria, thus paving the way, perhaps unintentionally, for a heterarchical as opposed to a hierarchical approach to assessing research standing. What that means is that when multiple matrices of evaluation are used, it offers an opportunity for more to shine under different lights. In other words, you pick the criteria that is important to you, and you see how well that institution or that organization is doing. Don't have a one-size-fits-all approach. One is reminded of U-Multi-Rank, a multi-dimensional global ranking of universities where users select their own criteria to compare universities based on criteria that matter to them. Similarly, a New York Times opinion piece in March 2023 introduced a tool called Build Your Own College Rankings, offering users the ability to pick school attributes that matter to them. The tool would then present a tailored ranking based on the preferred attributes. These opportunities begin to foreground how dominant rankings that the world is so seized by today adopt a one-size-fits-all approach that should perhaps give way to more flexible, tailored approaches that allow more to shine under different lights. In order for universities to ensure that their research contributions are purposeful, impactful, and sustainable, it is imperative that universities develop a clear and coherent vision, articulating the desired societal change resulting from their activities. This is not to the exclusion of a breadth of research that universities support, but strategic investment in selected areas, marshalling the expertise across disciplines and departments, and hiring strategically where necessary will stand a better chance of collectively impacting the world beyond its haloed walls. This vision should ideally be integrated with broader agendas such as sustainability, equity, and inclusion. This would ensure a unified, focused effort and avoid initiative fatigue. The vision must also identify the specific stakeholders for whom social value is being created. a well-defined understanding of who benefits from university activities, why those benefits matter, and how they will be delivered will create alignment and clarity. Indeed, these are not my ideas. They were the recommendations that came out of a 2022 Global Symposia for Social Value at Universities. To create such alignment, universities need to remain engaged externally with their communities, for which two approaches are apparent. The first is a more top-down institutional approach, such as the UK's Civic University Network, where the university directs its resources towards addressing local community needs strategically. This allows for a unified, well-coordinated effort that can deliver large-scale impact. The second is a bottom-up approach exemplified by Jonathan Grant's The New Power University, which is driven by distributed models and the initiatives of individuals and smaller groups within and connected to the institution. This entails grassroots innovation and engagement with individuals at all levels of the university engaging with their communities. It allows for a wider range of engagement activities, harnessing the diverse interests and skills of the university community. There are merits to both approaches. What matters is that the spirit of and commitment to engagement should be a critical part of a university's mission and not an add-on to the traditional focus areas of education and research. A university thus committed is a public purpose university, and as part of its social contract, places community engagement and commitment at the heart of its operations and seeks to benefit communities explicitly and strategically. Creating such alignment internally is a non-trivial task. In an institution full of independent-minded experts, developing a common framework, a whole-of-university approach that guides efforts to create and manage social value, to serve as a shared theory of change and an operational focus, as the Global Symposium calls for, is a huge challenge. To heed the call to move beyond ad hoc initiatives to a structured, more holistic approach that responds to societal needs runs up against all manner of resistances, with protests about infringements on academic freedom and the familiar refrains of anti-intellectual utilitarianism. For universities to realize their public value, therefore, requires navigation between those more corporate approaches of strategy, alignment, and targeted investment, and the much more independent, laissez-faire style that characterizes academia. At my own institution, I have sought to frame our approach as one of focus, framework, and freedom, where any effort to develop focus is to create critical mass of expertise, while offering a framework scopes the strategic priorities within which there is freedom for creative contributions. I'm not sure that my colleagues are persuaded, but there you have it. Beyond developing a clear and coherent vision and strategic focus, it is imperative to have clarity on what constitutes societal impact and public value and how they are to be assessed. As shared earlier, this is challenging too, as there is no widely accepted and consistent framework that facilitates recognition, measurement, and evaluation. Clarity is needed about what constitutes outputs, outcomes, and impact. And I have spent the best part of the last half hour discussing the associated challenges and possible solutions. If universities embrace the merits of and succeed in achieving societal impact through their research, it is important to develop clear, purposeful communication to demonstrate a university's public value. It is easy to do so when a breakthrough such as AstraZeneca occurs, addressing directly a clear and present danger. But not all research has that kind of existential impact in quite an immediate way. And yet, much research does impact on some dimensions of human life and quotidian experience. To be able to communicate effectively with external stakeholders is critical in ensuring that the university's contributions are visible and understood by all relevant parties. Finally, to truly effect change, universities have a vital role in advocating for change based on evidence-based research. By working to effect systemic changes, universities can influence broader societal shifts. To do so requires trust relationships between researchers and researched, between researchers, government, or corporations, and an openness to sharing information and data on the one hand, and a demonstration of responsible trustworthiness on the other. Let me conclude. The worth of university research lies in its capacity to create new insights, counter misinformation, and catalyze innovations. At the same time, universities are well positioned to promote cultural enrichment and enhance civic engagement, functioning as vital hubs for societal dialogue and facilitating knowledge exchange that extends beyond campus walls. Through public lectures, policy advisories, and partnerships, academia is connected to the wider world. In thus embracing research with impact and engagement and dialogue that extends beyond the Ivory Tower, universities can generate public value and contribute meaningfully to addressing the most pressing challenges of our time. What we cannot afford is to have academics who, like Alice, do not much care where they're going, that is, care less about what particular research they do or why they do it, as long as it gets published. Neither can we afford to have academics like the Duchess's cook, whom Alice encounters. I don't know how many of you remember the Duchess's cook, but the Duchess's cook was throwing pots and plates about, indiscriminately shaking pepper mills that caused everyone in the Duchess's house to sneeze, scream, and cry. In other words, academics who falsify data, engage in data dredging, manipulate citations, write unintelligibly, and otherwise behave in ways that cannot simply be waved away as harmless academic maneuvers. Just as the Hippocratic Oath sets out the values that guide medical professionals, and the Socratic Oath does the same for educators, perhaps a code of ethics and a commitment to a set of values would not be out of place for researchers. Perhaps an Aristotelian oath, in acknowledgement of the polymath philosopher scientist, or some Asian name might be good. Regardless, just as academics need to think about how our research can make the world a better place, so too do government agencies, private sector corporations, and non-profits need to be open to collaborations with academics, opening up data and dialogue, recognizing the contributions that universities and researchers can make. This must be so, even if research highlights, or rather research insights, may sometimes be contrarian, as long as they are responsible, rigorous, and evidence-based. After all, it was Nicholas Copernicus who first brought to attention how the Earth revolves around the Sun, not the other way around, and without the openness to divergent views, progress would not be possible. Universities too need to provide space and freedom for academics to pursue diverse interests, but at the same time balance that with greater urgency in directing resources towards global challenges and community needs, strengthening strategic focus and embracing societal impact as a worthy goal. With a whole-of-system approach, research holds promise to make the world a better place. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kong. For those watching the lecture on Facebook, please submit your comments and questions through the Facebook comment box. For audience members here, please step up to the mic to ask your questions. May I now invite Professor Chan Heng Chi, SUTD Honorary Professor, Lee Kuan Yew Center for Innovative Cities, and IPS's 7th S.R. Nathan Fellow to start the Q&A session. Professor Chan, please.
That was quite a tour de force.
Thank you.
Professor Lily Kong has just completed the last of her 3 lectures in the series as the 15th IPS Nathan, S.R. Nathan Fellow for the study of Singapore is up there. You know, this is a very impressive series of the IPS Nathan lectures is a very impressive and valuable series of lectures. And I thank IPS for doing this, because you've brought every year a thought leader in Singapore to focus in depth, to reflect and to analyze an issue, a problem that's relevant for Singapore. And I'm sure this whole body of lectures, you've produced books out of it. SR would be very proud of what has been achieved, and I think he would approve. But first, to you now, Lily, thank you very much for that lecture. Comprehensive, it's sharp. You focused really unblinkingly on the issues that face universities, especially today on the issues of research versus teaching, research for as an intellectual exercise or research for societal needs. And you were nuanced, but very sharp. Okay. This evening, we have gathered here academics and members of the public. So let me direct my question first. I can ask 2 questions, and I'll let the rest have a go. My 2 questions will be at the more public level, because we can get into an intramural debate about research, quality, tenure, promotions, etc. I'll leave that for others. My question is this. The universities cost a lot of money, you know, and unless academics want to be society's expensive pets, we better do something useful. As Derek Bock, the very well-known Harvard president, said, you know, we are the primary source of expertise. If not us, who? Who will do the research to help reach out for solutions for society? Why is this still an issue, or is it an issue amongst researchers that they don't care too much to do stuff for society's needs, that why should they be useful, you know? Is this in fact an issue? And related to that, I want to take up your other question of research impact. I think this is really important, because if we do research that is useful for societies, to meet society's challenges, how do you measure the impact? Are the university professors, the university leaders here, vice chancellors, addressing this issue in Singapore? Do you get together to discuss and say, what are the hard criteria to measure impact? And if you do bring in the measure of impact into your evaluations, does that make you a softer university? Okay, that's my first question.
Oh, that was the first. Sorry, I thought there were 2 there. 3.
You thought it was 2. Okay.
I'll just take this one first. So there is the question of whether, you know, researchers in university contexts are interested in making a difference to society, and relatedly then, if they did, how does that get assessed, and are they recognized for it? So the first part of the question first, I would say that, you know, at my own university, we've been having these conversations for the best part of the last year, and indeed we have made that quite a broad dialogue now in the last couple of weeks.
And actually, when you start to talk to faculty, many of them actually do have a sense of what they could do with their research that potentially could make a difference. But the world of academia, the global world of academia, is structured in such a way that it doesn't have the measurement framework, and therefore it's not measured. And when it's not measured, then people don't respond to that. And if you're thinking that you want to have portable, what's the word I'm looking for? You want to have, you want your credentials to be portable. And at some point in time, you might think, you know, I want to work in the US, or I want to work in New Zealand, or I want to work in wherever else in the world. Then the world of academia is generally using these technical academic metrics. And there isn't a framework, despite DORA, despite Leiden Manifesto, that is widely accepted in the same way that the academic metrics are. And so you can quite understand why the academics respond to where the cheese is. So I have to say, though, that with DORA, with the Leiden Manifesto, with the European Science Framework, with UK's REF, Hong Kong's RAE, Australia's Engagement and Impact Framework, etc., there is a beginning effort to think about how do we begin to, first of all, acknowledge and valorize this other kind of work, or this other kind of impact, and some beginning efforts to measure as such. And as with any measurement, it will take a while as we learn the merits and drawbacks and settle on something. The reason why I cited the Financial Times article that did rankings of business schools earlier this month was because it was interesting as the first rankings that looks at the academic metrics where you've published your impact factors and all that, but also is your work taken up in government documents, in patents, and so forth. And those are concrete metrics that people feel more comfortable with. The UK system of REF uses case studies, and that requires that somebody writes up, you know, what is the impact of my work qualitatively? But you all know that when something is qualitative versus the ability to measure, everybody gravitates to, oh, measurement, that's objective, that's fair, and so forth, right? And so the answer is somewhere in between. Where we will land, which measurement framework, etc., is hard to say, but I think these various efforts begin to point the way. At my own institution, we've been working on this for the best part of last year to develop something that's that recognizes what's going on in the world and indeed adopts much of that, but also has some element of bespokeness to it that you know, speaks to the Singapore context, our context, and so forth. We can't be too different because it's no good us saying, you know, Professor Tan Mei Ling, you're doing great work by our metrics. And then Mei Ling wants to go somewhere else and nobody recognizes any of it. So it's this global shift that is needed. And I personally think that that global shift will happen only when funding agencies begin to say, this is what we're looking at. Because if people want the research grants, they will respond to that. Thank you.
I know, and our research funding does nudge people towards producing such research. Let me ask you another question then. This is not a trick question, okay?
That means it's a trick question.
No, it isn't. No, it isn't. You know, what are the big ideas that have been produced by our research community in Singapore? Can you think of some? You know, I know probably in the science areas, breakthroughs are announced, but what are the big ideas that have come out of our research community? You know, for me, I'm a political scientist. The big contribution, I think, in political thinking is what I would call the strategy of small state survival. For Singapore is very relevant, but not just for Singapore, but for the world, because more than half the countries in the United Nations are deemed to be small states, small countries. Because if you have a population of less than 10 million, you're a small country. Now, the theory of small state survival, or our strategies of small state survival, came from the politicians and the bureaucrats. FTAs, sign FTAs, what you have to do, to extend your borders. You have to be open, you've got to have domestic strength first before, and now everybody is talking about domestic strength before you go outside. But I think these ideas were developed not by academics. What we did was to step back and say, oh, this is what they did. Okay, that's not very hard. So can you think of any big ideas that you think our academic community has produced?
It's a difficult question, because if I name someone's work and somebody else's work is not named,
it's okay.
I could be in trouble.
Okay.
But
okay.
I'm going to try. I'm going to try. So, as you said, in the medical sciences, in the more technical fields, maybe it's a little bit more concrete and easy. One thinks of Duke NUS's work where they're looking at the connection between Zika and brain cancer, for example, right? And it's still ongoing work, but these are the sorts of things that people can point to and say, aha, that's where this was discovered, or that's where that was produced, right? AstraZeneca, et cetera, But it gets harder when it's about ideas. Ideas that have greater difficulty in being established as a direct correlation, a direct cause of how people, states, nations behave. You talked about the theory of small states or strategy of small states. I'll just put forward another one, and then I'll come back to inductive, deductive work. I don't want to embarrass Bing Huat, but he's sitting here. And I think at a point in time when people thought that Singapore had no ideology, we're just very pragmatic, we go wherever, whatever is most pragmatic we'll do, and we're not guided by a particular set of ideologies. He said that pragmatism is our ideology. And it explains a lot of how we behave. And we are very consistent in holding on to that ideology. And so his work on pragmatism as an ideology, I think, actually has been quite groundbreaking. Owe me dinner. I just wanted to come back to what you said about how, with the strategy of small state survival, it was really from the bureaucrats and the practitioners where the idea then got taken into academia, politicians and so forth. So there's a question of whether we go from the general, i.e. the theoretical and the abstract, to the specific through application, or do you go from the specific and generalize from that into a theory? And I think both are equally valid. And what you've described is perhaps sort of more specific instances that become generalized into a theory. The reverse hopefully does happen as well. Recently, we had the honor of President Tharman visiting us at SMU and having a dialogue precisely about research impact, and so forth. And he encouraged us to think about observing what's going on in the world of corporations, because we're a management university. He said, look at what businesses are doing, look at the entrepreneurial landscape, and what can you learn from there that you might be able to extract more general theories from as such that might be useful to others. So anyhow, this is to say that there is both the inductive and the deductive as such that are both equally valid.
Thank you. Now, can we take questions from the audience? Here we have one.
Irene.
Hi, I'm Irene Ho, former journalist, editor, and incurable capo. I'd like to know how you think. I thought the lecture was really wow. And I'd like to know, what do you think that my own field, media, can can do in this effort to modernize or revolutionize education and research?
Wow.
Yeah.
That's your question. For a moment, I heard you say my lecture was really wild, and I thought, oh,
She did say that.
was it wild or wow? Okay.
Oh, wow.
So that's a really good and difficult question. I actually think that educational institutions can work a whole lot more closely with media in a variety of ways. One, we know that there is so much misinformation and mistrust in science and so forth. If educational institutions and the media could work together in trusted ways, we could make a whole lot of difference in public understanding of science and counter the misinformation that is going on in so many parts of the world. That's one. Two, I think that media plays a really important role in the communication dimension of what I was saying earlier. Even while academics do a lot of research, we tend to speak in the language that we're trained in, not necessarily in the magniloquent way that I was talking about, but just in terms of the technicality of it. And working with a seasoned media person can be so helpful in not losing the depth and rigor of thought, and yet being able to translate that to an intelligent public. And so those are a couple of ways that I think with the help of a responsible media industry, the work of educational institutions could be amplified quite significantly. In terms of education, I mean, I will just extend from what I've just said, which is that I think when we think of education, we tend to think of education within the confines of educational institutions, but public education is so important to lift the tenor of society, to be a more cultivated citizenry and so forth. And media in public education could play such a wonderful role. And thank you for all that you've written. You write beautifully.
Right. You know, I have just 4 minutes left. There's a question on that's come in. Oh, sorry. This gentleman, please.
Francis.
Right.
Francis Pabri. Yes, you talk about all these 5 M's, the misalignment, the whatever words you use. Now, isn't the research process already very stable in this system called the peer review process? And a lot of those problems will be solved if you can strengthen and do something to that. That's the process that goes through all research, and it's been traditional for hundreds of years. And it's a system that has worked very well, I think. So if we can strengthen that process, many of the problems you illustrated might not be apparent as we are worrying about.
You're right. The system exists and the system can work. But any system works only as well as the people who make up the system and what drives the people. So if we use citation counts as the measure of success, then somebody in the system is going to have a bright idea of saying, aha, since I'm the gatekeeper, I'm going to ask for more citations of my work, my journal, etc. And that's where the peer review system begins to fall apart. Because it's not the system that's the problem, it's the motivations that drive the behaviors that becomes the problem.
Thank you. You know, we have 2 minutes left, but I'm going to, extend this a bit because we should take questions online. We've had this audience, so let them ask a question. The question that came in is, as an academic, I have seen academics who focus on teaching, who do not get contracts renewed, and academics who make use of their students to conduct research for them, and then publish such research under their names and not mention their students. How do you change this? How can you change this culture?
Yeah. So teaching can get sidelined. That is the brutal truth. And that is unfortunate. And the logic of that quote which I read you just incenses me, right? That it's okay to focus more on research because then your rankings go up, and when your rankings go up, the student credential is good. What happened to talking about the quality of the educational experience of teaching and learning? And yet, that has happened, and it is unfortunate. I do think that it is important for people who are in the classroom to either do research, because then you bring the research into the classroom, or you keep up with research so that what you're bringing into the classroom is at the cutting edge. You don't have to be doing the research yourself. You must keep up with the research. And they're both as good. In my own university, when I joined my current university, SMU, I was a little bit surprised. There was such a thing called a lecturer track, and then there was an education track, and then there was the tenure track. And I thought, what's the difference between the lecturer track and the education track? Isn't it all about teaching? And there is a difference. For the education track, there is some expectation of research still. The tenure track, of course, is full expectation of research. The lecturer track, there is no expectation of research, but an expectation to continue keeping up with research, and I think that's important. It is unfortunate that there will be those who use their students' work. I think that co-publication with students is actually a very positive thing. That you're working with your students, you're acknowledging the students' work, but you're also contributing to lifting the work to a more publishable level, especially if students have not published before. And I also think that it is an honor and what's the word I'm looking for, something exciting for a young student to see their name in print. So I very much encourage working with students, but acknowledging their contributions is critical. Otherwise, it's just dishonesty and bullying.
Yeah, well, one final question, okay? And Chris L. has put in this question. Some say that in the 21st century, the economic center of gravity will shift to Asia. Should universities in Singapore strategically invest more in Asian language competencies and also focus on comparative studies, for instance, cultural studies, comparative religion, arts, comparative philosophy, ethics, both in education and research?
So again, we've just had some of these discussions at my own university, but in the context of education. I'm going to respond in that light, but it will have a parallel with research. We asked ourselves whether we wanted our graduates to be Asia-ready and whether that was a good quality. And I was surprised when a colleague said, no, we don't want that. And I thought, oh, that's a bit strange. But he and she, because there were a few voices, were totally right. They wanted our students to be Asia-ready, but to be globally agile. Because the relevance of what our graduates do, and indeed our research, is not Asia for Asia only. It's for Asia to the world. So being able to translate what we do in education and in research so that we bring insights from Asia into the world is our value proposition. Yes, learning all the languages, or some of the languages, studying the culture, the politics, the society, the economics of Asia is very important, but not in a navel-gazing kind of way. To the extent that we're able to take that out to the world beyond Asia, that's an even extended benefit.
Thank you. I think we've come to the end of the afternoon, the lecture. Can we show Professor Kong our appreciation?
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kong and Professor Chan. May I now invite IPS Director, Mr. Janadas Devan, to give his closing remarks. Director, please.
As Heng Chi said, that was a tour de force. I remember reading somewhere, I think it might have been Einstein, who defined education as that which you remember after you've forgotten everything else. So what would I remember of Lily's lectures 5 years from now, 10 years from now, long years after the book has been published? And she typically wrote the book and then edited it down for her talks. Because the written lecture is far longer than the talk that she delivered. What I would remember, I suppose, a few choice quotes from today's John Dewey on the distinction or the false distinction between practical, applied, and pure research. By the way, I was reminded of this when you mentioned Bengwat's book on pragmatism being our ideology. John Dewey was one of the main figures in the American school of philosophy called pragmatism. And in fact, he was probably one of the founders of that school. And it's not an irrelevant reference here, as I would note in a little while. Another on the quote on Byzantine language of academics, passing for academic profundity, and the quote, I can't remember who you quoted, the confusion of academic prose with academic pose. I love that quotation. But I think what I'd most remember about her talks is her clarity. Her focus on practical questions, the impression she gave, the overwhelming impression she gave, of a researcher, an academic, and a distinguished one at that, who was bent on action. And thus, the words that came trundling out today, problem-solving, practical impact, real-world consequences of research. So if I may humbly suggest the title for your book, The Idea of a University, A Pragmatic View. So, which of course, according to my old friend Bengwat, is our ideology. Yeah. Anyway, I would like to thank everyone who's been involved in making this semester's S.R. Nathan lecture series such a success, including each one of your moderators, Tai Yong, the first one, Professor Chua, the second, and of course, Heng Chi in the third. And I would also like to thank the IPS team that helped organize this, led by Kai Shin. While we conclude the end of the 15th IPS Nathan lectures, I can't believe that it's 15 already. I would like to announce that first, our 14th IPS S.R. Nathan Fellow will be launching, Tan Chong Meng will be launching his book in a couple of months, February. So, I look forward to the launch of his book. And we have lined up already the 16th, 17th, and 18th IPS Nathan lectures. They will be held every semester, academic semester. The next S.R. Nathan Fellow is Philip Yeo, the former A-Star chairman. And then after that, followed by when Philip Yeo is first half of next year, and then after that, in the what do they call it, the first semester of the new academic year, Piyush Gupta, the outgoing CEO of DBS, followed by Dr. Sean Lam, the former president of the Nature Society of Singapore. Besides these ongoing IPS Nathan lectures, we are also actually starting a new S.R. Nathan Fellowship series called the S.R. Nathan Fellowship Young Leaders Seminar Series. So by inviting young academics, I've insisted they all be less than 35 years old, to present their existing ideas or new ideas, exciting new ideas, existing research. The topics seek to enrich the vibrant intellectual life of the campus. Our first young leaders S.R. Nathan Fellow is Melissa Low, who's right now a research fellow at the university, NUS Center for Nature-Based Climate Solutions. and she will be presenting her insights on Singapore's response to climate change. So I invite all of you to attend. This won't be a big thing like this, but it'll be a workshop, and there'll be a panel accompanying it. So I'm very grateful for all the people who have helped us raise funds for the IPS Nathan lecture series, and it's because they were so generous that we have more money than we can use for our IPS Nathan lecture series, and so we have enough money for this other additional program. I think we will invite 1 or 2 a year of the young fellows. Thank you very much, above all to Lily, for delivering such a wonderfully rich series of lectures. I look forward to you publishing the book soon after Chong Meng's book appears in a couple of months, because it's already been written. And thank you very much for attending, all of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Director. We've come to the end of today's lecture. We would like to hear your views on the event. Please click our link on the Facebook feed or scan the QR code on the screen to submit your feedback. Thank you all for attending your lectures. Have a good evening ahead.